Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Santa Rosa, California. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko in the beautiful Mahoning Valley of Ohio.
Yeah. So today, we're going to be talking about one of our favorite topics, which is direct action. There's a lot of criminalization of dissent and direct action going on. We've had a recent show on Atlanta just recently with Lauren Regan from the Civil Liberties Defense Center. We cover this topic quite a lot. And so to join us and talk about it a little bit more is our old friend, Jake Conroy. Jake, welcome to the Green and Red podcast again, return visitor.
Thanks for having me back.
Return guest, not visitor. Jake, for folks who aren't familiar, is an activist. He was part of the Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty campaign and was one of the SHAC 7, which we'll probably talk a little bit about today. He's a former political prisoner. He hosts the Cranky Vegan on YouTube and co-hosts the podcast Radicals and Revolutionaries. So Jake, in looking at sort of what has been going on, we have a lot of interesting sort of dynamics going on in the movement today, and we're seeing some escalation on both sides. We're seeing people doing a lot more property destruction, and then we're also seeing a lot of like police repression. Like we're seeing this criminalization of dissent through legislation and slap suits, but then also, the police seem much more militant and hardcore than we've seen previously. It's almost like a backlash. And just wondering, maybe this is the kickoff. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Nope, not at all.
Okay. Just opinions, no thoughts, just opinions.
I don't know. I think there's like the broader view of like, why does the government react that way? I think they react that way because they're scared. I think people realize the power that they have, and they and the anger that they have, and the conventional means that we've been told all these years of how we make change, and the correct way, the quote unquote correct way to make change is, pass a law, vote for this person, pull a lever in the ballot box, and sign a petition, and all those things have its place. But when it feels like overwhelmingly that you've done these things ad nauseum and everyone just kind of laughs at it and brushes it aside, I think the rational response is like, well, then let's move on to something different. And I think frustration and anger and the realization that like the world was literally collapsing around us, and if something doesn't change immediately, we are screwed. And I think people realize that direct action is one of those things that gets results immediately. So I don't know, it's an interesting time in activism and in the world.
I think the ruling class, whatever you want to call them, understood what happened in 2020 better than a lot of people we hang out with did, because they were frightened, and they saw that 25 million people are on the streets. People were burning down police precincts and tearing down statues, and I think they're still aware that happened, whereas a lot of people, that energy seems to have dissipated significantly. Now you do have pockets of like what's happening in Atlanta, but what do you think happened, like from that high point, that fever pitch of 2020 to was it, just kind of the election? People decided that it was more important to get rid of Trump and vote for Biden. I mean, what kind of led to that moment, and then the dissipation of that moment, fairly quickly?
Well, I think part of it probably was the pandemic, COVID. I think that probably put a bit of a damper on the way a lot of people decided to go and protest or be in the streets and be in large crowds. But I do think that I think we're like I said, most of us are fed the idea that if we just vote the right person into power, then yay, everything's going to be great for the next 4 years, and we don't need to worry about anything. So I think that's natural. I mean, that's what and obviously this is U.S. based or U.S. focused, these opinions, but that's what we've been told over and over again. And I think, mainstream, middle of the road, quote unquote liberals, or that's their view. Like, oh yeah, things are great now. We got Biden, and then with Trump's creeping up the for 2024, it'll all start over again. But I do think that, like, the interesting thing about 2020 was, I think we saw a lot of corruption, more than what I think the normal person is used to seeing when it comes to government politics. And I think we saw mass mobilizations, but we also saw, and maybe this was just my takeaway, and I'm looking at this with rose tinted glasses, but I think, the thing that really stuck out to me about COVID and activism was that we saw what happens when you disrupt a supply chain, when you really throw a spanner in the works. And it doesn't matter how many people might want something or not want something. If the system and the supply isn't there to take care of it, the system will collapse. And we saw that. I spent a lot of time looking at and being involved in the animal rights movement, but definitely with the food system, and the food system really collapsing with COVID. But other pieces of society as well falling apart when the supply chain broke. And to me, and I think hopefully for a lot of organizers, started to realize, oh, well, this is what happens if we can mess with the supply chain. It doesn't necessarily matter how many people we have on our side. If we have enough strategic people and smart people and active people to disrupt the supply or gum up the works, we can win. And I think that trickled down to a lot of core organizers. I would say, like, things like Atlanta, them, like, organizers really realizing, like, yeah, we need people on our side for this, but also we need smart pressure campaigning, we need strategy, and we just really need a handful of people to really be able to apply that pressure in the ways that they needed to apply it. And I think it's happening. And I think we've seen that in pockets around the country, in the world, in different movements, with different results. But ultimately, I think that's, to me, that's kind of a culmination of what happened in 2020. It's not all bleak, I don't think, when it comes to organizing.
It's interesting. This is what I find this interesting conversation, and one of the things I think is, on your show, and then you go around and do trainings and talks around the country and around the world around organizing, and particularly around strategy and around direct action, pressure campaigns, anti-corporate pressure campaigns. And, I think the SHAC campaign was a very militant campaign, and it was also very strategic and effective. And it's interesting to contrast, like what I've seen with Atlanta is I see a lot of people who have done similar tactics, like they've pressured like second and third tier actors, which were connected to the project, to the Cop City project. And to contrast that with what I see in Europe and has come to the US, and it's a little bit in the mainstream climate movement, which is like throwing soup on pieces of art, which to me, I'll be really critical of it. I don't see the strategy in that. And I'm just wondering, it's spectacle versus strategy almost. And I worry that that's where we're headed, because that was getting like mainstream New York Times sort of articles and like all kinds of attention. And it bothers me a little bit that we could be headed down that direction, down that path.
Do you think that we are, though? I don't know. I would hope that it's cyclical, and I feel like I can mostly speak for the animal rights movement, but there was like Animal Rebellion, which is now called Animal Rising, which was kind of the sister organization of Extinction Rebellion, for instance. So I think we're responsible for the soups, Soup for Your Family portraits.
I think they were pouring out the milk in the stores in the UK, right?
Animal Rising or Animal Rebellion was, but I think Extinction Rebellion did the soups. Is that correct, or was it Just Stop Oil?
It was a group. It was Just Stop Oil, which is like a splinter group of XR.
Right. Okay. Just want to make sure I got it all straight. But yeah. I think
there's a lot of names. There's a lot of names out there with Rebellion.
Rising,
all that's out there.
But I think it is like people. I think there was the idea of like lifestyle change, and we see this in this cycle has definitely happened in the animal rights movement big time. But I think it also happened with like XR and things like that, where it was like, oh, we just need lifestyle change, and we need this and that, and buy the right products and blah blah blah. And obviously that's failed us. And I think that's when like we see XR come into play. and they're like, all right, we need mass mobilization and mass arrests, and we need to get thousands of people arrested and blah, blah, blah. And that happened for a couple of years. And like, oh, we need to disrupt society. If we get just enough disruption in society, society will wake up and see what's going on, and they will rebel with us. And maybe, hopefully, but I don't really think that's gonna. I don't think it's like a sound strategy or a sole strategy that I would rely on. But I do think the next like rational phase of organizing is that being like, well, actually, we don't need a mass mobilization that big in order to pressure corporations. And so I think there is that kind of pendulum swing of like, individual lifestyle change will change the world. Oh, we just need a handful of people to go after corporations. And I think XR is kind of in that bottom rung of the, or bottom swing of the pendulum. And I feel like it will go back up. And I think at least with Animal Rising or Animal Rebellion, you know, I think that was the natural progression they took. And so, you know, I think their bread and butter, all those organizations are big, you know, publicity stunt actions that get a lot of attention. And I see the value in them, but I'm not sure I see like this, like how strategic they're going to be in achieving the things we need to achieve quickly. But I don't know. Maybe this is the rare time I'm optimistic, but I feel like things are moving.
You heard it here first on the Green Red podcast. The optimistic vegan, no longer the optimistic.
I do feel like, yeah, things are swinging towards the understanding of just making systemic change through pressuring industry and corporations and the people that are responsible for making those decisions. So I don't know. I think we got some cool things. The problem is we run out of time. You know what I mean? there's the problem.
You know, I think you're right that, you know, this doesn't have to be a majoritarian movement, that, you know, you can have, I often call it a guerrilla movement, meaning just it can be small pockets of people at strategic points doing strategic things. But, you know, it would help, obviously, if it were a bigger movement. Do you think like kind of more mainstream environmental groups and NGOs like Sierra Club or 350, are they kind of coming around and seeing that, you know, you have to do more now, that it's important to take this on at the point of direct action?
Maybe,
because in the past, I mean, they you know, I've been on their mailing list forever, and you know, it's always sign this petition, send us money, you know, click this to send an email to your congressman, that kind of thing. But they seem to shy away from the kind of stuff that, you know, for instance, going on in Atlanta, or
right.
You know. 350 hasn't, to their credit. They've
come around.
They've leaned in hard on Atlanta. Sierra Club less so. Sierra Club's also having an implosion there. So
yeah,
I think that if we look at these movements and these campaigns from a broader viewpoint, like I think we need groups, not necessarily Sierra Club, but we need larger groups that are going to do the petitions, and they're going to do that broad level support. And I think as long as they're not like shitting on and co-opting grassroots movements, which is generally what large NGOs often do, I think they can and they should work in concert together for the broader goal of like winning said campaign or pushing Cop City to close. Like, I think you need all those pieces. I always think of like, we did this, I took this from a retreat we did at my job. But, you know, the idea of like, if you look at like the population in like a pie or half of a pie, and you have people like way over on the side are like, I'm opposed to this. And then you have like people that are like, I don't really give a shit one or the other. And then you have people that are like, I kind of get what they're saying. And then you're like, yeah, I agree with you. And then like the far left is like, fuck yeah, like burn it all down. You don't need all these people on this side to move all the way to your side. You just need the people that are kind of like, I hate this, to move to the either way. And the either way people to move to like, I can support that. I see where they're coming from. I'll sign a petition. So I think like that's where the big NGOs have their place, is shifting those people that are neutral or opposed to it to kind of understanding or being on your side to the point where you have enough, you know, general population that is indifferent or in favor of you. Because it's a big lift, and I don't think grassroots movements necessarily have the capacity to do both, to shift large portions of the general public and do the hard-hitting campaigning that needs to be done. And I don't think the NGOs have the ability to do hard-hitting campaigns. So I think that's where the grassroots movement has to plug in and do the really difficult, work, boots in the ground type of stuff. But I think if the NGOs are earnest and then recognize that that's their position to shift that the public in that way, then I think it can be worked in concert with the grassroots to be successful. I don't think it always happens that way, but again, I'm just being optimistic here.
No, but both of you, I mean, this is what you guys do. So you travel, all over, and you talk to lots of different types of groups. I mean, do you think there's been a shift in the last, I don't know, few years, 5 years, 10 years, people more willing to kind of become more, kind of adversarial or confrontational?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
definitely.
I would say so.
I've seen the upward trend of it since 2011 with the Occupy movement, but I feel like since 2020, it's very people are much more confrontational and much more militant in their challenging of whatever it is they're challenging. I feel like that's why things have gotten so escalated at Cop City, honestly.
Yeah. Do these tend to be more like younger people who are kind of come of age in this moment, or
Gen Z? Yeah. And people who, people who like Gen Zers or, early 20s and younger, been told all their life that they have no future because of climate change and because of, our crumbling infrastructure and, Gilded Age economy and things like that. So they're very much in this sort of confront and burn it all down sort of mentality in my experience.
But I also think that there is something to be said for people recognizing the need for militancy, but that militancy looks different for each person, right? Like someone that's older, crossing over into that uncomfortable position of activism for them is going to look different than the young Gen Zer. Yeah. But that shift, I think, is also important, right? Those people that gave $20 every month to Sierra Club are now saying, oh, maybe I should give my $20 to Stop Cop City. And I think that shift is also towards, militancy, for lack of a better term, for someone in that demographic, I think is happening as well. People that are joining Black Lives Matter marches that maybe never had joined a march in their life and just oh yeah, enough's enough. I'm going to join 100,000 people in the streets. And that's something I've never done before. And that's their form of militancy. So I think all of that is valuable. People recognizing that they are angry about something and there are outlets for it. And it's okay to vent their frustration through those outlets, I think is exciting.
Talking about the shifts too is it's interesting thinking about these sort of cultural shifts. We actually just recently interviewed the director of How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and which is somewhat mainstream. It's been in theaters. It's on Amazon now. He told us it's going to be on Hulu in the fall. And I feel like it's another sort of marker, at least in my head, that some of these more militant tactics are becoming more culturally accepted almost. It's and he definitely, speaking with us, framed it as, it's an act of self-defense to do an action where you blow up a pipeline. And what are you willing to do? What would you do if someone pointed a gun at your head?
But where does the bubble burst at this point? I mean, if indeed all of this is cyclical, at what point does the bubble burst and people are direct action? And then we're back to the lifestyle change education route.
Well, I'm sure it's after we elect some really charismatic Democratic leader, big D Democratic leader.
I thought we already did that.
Yeah, I don't really think it's cyclical so much as I think it's just the people in charge have different ways of controlling protest and dissent. And what's ironic is the right is very active and very aggressive and often violent and very, very ugly. And I'm certainly not advocating that we do those kinds of things, but at the same time, I mean, it does seem, I guess I'm not as optimistic. It does seem that this is kind of a one-sided battle. Remember, before Roe v. Wade, women said, we will be ungovernable. And if you overturn Roe v. Wade, we're going to, and maybe I missed it, but I didn't see anything. And now that's been a decent election issue, but still, I didn't see, we heard all this bragging, we're going to shut it down, we're going to do this and that, and nothing happened. And so I guess I'm not as optimistic. I think what you're seeing in Atlanta is really inspiring. But do you sense that there are kind of people who are also getting fed up with the talk from liberals? We're going to do this, we're going to do that, and saying screw that, and we're going to take more direct action. We're going to send $20 to Cop City. Or, do you think there's a shift in that regard too?
I mean, I can't say if that's true nationally or globally, but it feels that way to me. Like in the pockets of places that I've been, I feel like, I've done trainings in the last couple of years in Europe and including Atlanta to some of the Stop Cop City folks doing pressure campaign trainings there. And, it's not all young people, predominantly is, but you do see people that are, from different generations that are like, yeah, I want to know how to do this stuff. And I want to know how I can play a part in it, despite like my age or my class or whatever. And so I do think that there are people that are looking for new outlets. But I would like to see more people being ungovernable. That sounds pretty good.
Well, I mean, I think that's something we've if you guys are more directly involved in this. With me, it's more of an academic thing that I've studied. And I mean, but that's kind of a common thing, right? Where, we're going to become ungovernable and we're going to do this and that. And then, in 2020, it happened. It was all spontaneous. And, the liberals were as freaked out as much as I think the right wing did with that. And really, look, the Republicans aren't wrong. It was all these Democratic mayors who came in and they've actually refunded the police and they've cracked down. Atlanta, the establishment in Atlanta is heavily Democratic. So I think that that moment, which I thought was beautiful in a lot of ways, kind of has passed. And I guess I'm not as hopeful as you, or I don't know if where Scott is on that. But
I think there's always, you never really know what that inflection moment's going to be.
Yeah.
But it always, I think it kind of takes you by surprise. And I think you just kind of have to I don't know, be prepared for the next one, but you can act on it quickly and smartly.
Yeah. I'll say that's why I think that's why I feel like having some of these strategic campaigns, even when it's like a sort of lull in that sort of popular movement space, can be really useful. I feel like there's a lot of political education that comes out of those campaigns. There's where people network, they get to know each other, they get skills. And so when we saw that sort of moment happen around George Floyd, there were people who knew how to set up a bail fund, pretty quickly. And that's actually when the National Bail Fund movement started. And there's recently found this out, I didn't realize this, that there's 100 bail funds all over the country in cities. It's the Atlanta one that just got actually attacked by the state of Georgia. But, I feel like there's a lot of skill development and political education, and also sort of banging on these companies' doors, I feel like is all at least a pretty useful thing when we're not seeing the 20 million people in the street. Not that I'm optimistic. I'm not as optimistic as Jake about things, but.
Well, I guess, when, for instance, when Tortuguita was killed, right, the initial media response to that was they just took the cop story and they swallowed it and they ran with that.
Yeah.
And, anybody who's studied this at all or been involved in this at all knows it was bullshit from the start. But by the time that trickled out, that story had so much oxygen. And I just, wondered if to me, that's really difficult to overcome, right? Because these guys can create the debate, they can create the narrative. And by the time, the truth trickles out, I don't know, is it too late?
I feel like the Stop Cop City movement is bigger and stronger than ever before. And I think that's because people were really put, as awful as that situation was and how tragic it was, and put a spotlight on it, on the project and the cops in general, and the activist camps and all the different people working on that issue. It just blew it up huge. I mean, to me, that feels like that's all that anyone's really talking about right now in activist circles, which I think is great. Even what was it yesterday, where 500 people showed up to
public comment
city council
at the council
meeting, and a whole lot more trying to get online.
Yeah, they weren't allowed
in. Camping out overnight. Like, I'm not sure that's what would have happened 6 months ago or 8 months ago. But
Yeah, no, I think you're right,
yeah,
but it hasn't, I mean, the repression hasn't abated though. I mean, they're arresting people, terrorism charges for passing out flyers and for setting up a bail fund. I mean, I guess that's the point. Like they have these strategies and they're doubling down.
for
And no,
sure.
I mean, I think what Atlanta, you're right. I mean, I think it's inspiring to see what they're doing there, but at the same time, I don't know. I'm just afraid somebody else is going to get shot and the police are just going to kind of ratchet it up.
Yeah. I think that like the response is out of fear. I think that they know that they're on the defensive, but they almost always win. You know what I mean? In one way or another.
That's the point. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's why it's important to be fast with your strategies and make them short-term strategies so that you're not sitting around for the next 2, 3, 4 years trying to figure out what to do next, and the state has a chance to catch up with you. Like you got to be quick and nimble with your strategy and be ready to go. And I think it's just like, I think in the United States, we have this idea that we can make change without sacrifice. And I'm not saying like being shot by the police. I'm talking about being arrested for, for trumped up charges, for police repression. Like that's what happens when you are trying to change really big systems that have a lot of power, money, and government backed funding and support. Like no one's going to roll over for you. And so it means you might have to get arrested. It means that you're going to have to make sacrifices. It means that, you might not have the nice fancy job or the big house and the nice car. It's like there are going to be sacrifices to be made. And it's unfortunate. It sucks. But, if we want to change what we see here in the United States for the better, some people are going to have to do the difficult work and make the difficult choices.
You're a person who suffered some serious state repression. You went to prison for resisting, a company around animal rights issues, animal liberation issues. And so we're seeing this sort of like a certain level, like an escalation, like people in different states, not just Georgia, are getting domestic terror charges, but in Georgia, they've been particularly outrageous. There's like something like 19 states have passed anti-protest laws. And I'm wondering, kind of reflecting back on, what you were doing 20 or 25 years ago, if there's any, thoughts or advice that you would give to people today who are also like, doing actions, doing campaigns, but then also like looking at like some serious repression.
Yeah. I mean, obviously it's different.
What would the 20-year-old Jake say?
Fuck it, just go for it. Go hard. Who cares? Obviously it's hard to apply what happened to us then to what is happening now. I think the idea, just some really quick background, is that there was a grassroots pressure campaign against one of the world's largest animal testing laboratories in the world. It was going on in 18 countries, and myself and a handful of people organized the campaign here in the United States. It was very horizontally organized and very non-hierarchical. We had our own blueprint and roadmap as to how we thought we should shut this place down, but anyone could participate in any way that they wanted. And as long as there was no physical violence being used, then we would support your decision to do those things. So that meant people could participate in any way they wanted. They could write petitions, make phone calls, go and protest, home demonstrations, direct action, vandalism, liberations, things like that. The government, we did a lot of secondary and tertiary targeting, going after the banks and insurance companies and auditors and internet companies and everyone that worked with this laboratory. We got them delisted from the New York Stock Exchange, so forth and so on. Their share price dropped from like $30 to a couple of pennies at the height of the campaign. And because of that, all the corporations that we went after us, mostly through legal means by getting injunctions and trying to stop our ability to protest. We had slap suits put against us. We had a civil federal RICO lawsuit brought against us. And eventually the US government said we were the biggest threat to the security of the United States alongside the Animal Liberation Front and Earth Liberation Front. Eventually, they charged us with this law called the Animal Enterprise Protection Act. I know this is going on longer than I should, but the Animal Enterprise Protection Act is a law that they passed to basically allow them to charge animal rights activists as domestic terrorists, with the idea that if you crossed a state line to disrupt a business that uses animals, and you did more than $10,000 worth of physical damage to the property, you could be charged as a domestic terrorist. It was to prevent people from driving around the country and breaking into fur farms and animal testing laboratories. What they said for us is that we crossed state lines using the internet, because we were organizing through the web, through the World Wide Web, which was kind of a new thing at that time. That we crossed state lines using the internet. We did more than $10,000 worth of economic damage to the corporation, and therefore we should be tried as domestic terrorists, which essentially we were. We were found guilty. We took it to trial, found guilty, and then we all got sentenced to various stays in prison. I was sentenced to 4 years, which I did in 2 federal prisons. I think, and again, it's the repression is going to look different and feel different. But the general idea was that, these corporations were doing everything they could possibly do to stop us. They were doing a lot of temporary restraining orders, permanent restraining orders to limit our ability to protest or stop us from protesting. They sued us a bunch of times, I think 24 times. We had 24 different lawsuits over the course of 4.5 years to try to stop the protest, but also to financially bankrupt us because we're just a small grassroots group. The federal civil RICO lawsuit held a bunch of us as individuals, including myself, for $12 million apiece. Thankfully, we beat that one. Slap suits in 5 different states to try to shut us down. And of course, the criminal charge. And we had a lot of, we were being followed. We had infiltration. We had snitches. We had our phones tapped. We had our internet monitored. We were the biggest FBI investigation of the time. And so, when you're a 23, 24-year-old kid, and this is what's happening to you, there's a lot to process and a lot to think about, and a lot to try to overcome in order to achieve the things you want to achieve. And, I think when I think about how we got around a lot of that stuff, the 2 pieces that I always think about, one is that we really relied on the short-term strategies, the idea of like picking your target and how you want to achieve the thing you want to achieve and figuring out how to do it as quickly as possible, probably in less than 12 months. So that your opponent, whether that's the corporation or the government or both, they don't have enough time to file a lawsuit, get attorneys, build a case, file a lawsuit, file it against you. Or they don't have time to build the case and put you in jail before you've won your objective. And I think that's what really worked in our favor, is that every time we had a restraining order against us, a SLAPP suit against us, a RICO suit against us, we won that portion of the campaign, and the corporation abandoned the laboratory. And they were just like, well, we're not going to keep, some of these corporations are spending $2 million a month to try to stop us. And they're just like, well, we're not involved with this laboratory anymore. They're not protesting against us anymore. And so we're not going to spend $2 million a month to try to stop them for the next 2 or 3 years to make sure this doesn't happen again. So I think that is a big piece to that. And the second thing, which is a little broad, but I do think it's important, is that as grassroots activists that engage in DIY activism and lifestyles, do-it-yourself activism, that we are smart and we're scrappy and we're creative and we are strategic and we are smart. And that allows us to circumnavigate roadblocks that these large corporations put up, governments put up. They are very monolithic, not just in their size and stature, but their approach. They think they can just plop this big thing down in front of you and be like, yeah, no way you can get around that. And so I think when you are creative and you're smart and scrappy, you always find a way to get around it. And so these restrictions on protests or these arrests or these trumped up charges on terrorism, they're awful. I don't want anyone ever to have to go through that, but we are smart enough and strategic enough to figure out ways to get around them. And frankly, We saw this in the SHAC campaign, and I think we see it in the Stop Cop City campaigns. Is that if they're just going to arrest people and trumped up charges, just don't let anyone know who you are or what you're doing. And I think what to bring the conversation full circle is that's why so many people end up turning to direct action. I can go to a protest and I can hold a sign, I can get photographed and be put into a file somewhere, and maybe some point down the road I get arrested for handing out leaflets like they've been doing in Atlanta and charging them with terrorism. Or I can put on a mask, I can go out and smash a window or burn a cop car or paint a building, which is also what's also been happening in Atlanta. And no one will ever know who I am or that I did it, hopefully. And I get to continue with my activism in day-to-day life. And I think it's a tough balance, because ultimately, usually the government's going to win that fight, right? They're eventually, going to smash some sort of cause down enough. But if you can get your movement and your campaign pushed through quick enough and you win quick enough, it doesn't matter if they can smash it down or not, because you've already won.
I guess you guys, the issue, I think you work very closely with this climate change, and if polling is to be believed, I think most Americans understand that's a really serious crisis. And on a lot of other issues, guns and abortion rights and even wokeness, most Americans, I think, kind of have a fairly progressive, view on it. But these issues kind of, we're kind of subject to minority rule in the US, right? Small groups of people, are able to kind of get what they want, even though majorities don't agree with it. How would you, kind of tell people to go about this on guns, on abortion rights, on climate change? Because they certainly haven't become ungovernable, although in Atlanta, there's they're doing something like that. But, what would be the approach you would suggest for people, to kind of go out there? Like, how do you make that leap to go from, I'm going to sign a move on petition to, I'm going to put on a mask and go out into a protest or something?
I'm not suggesting anyone do anything illegal. First of all, I was using the mask as a figurative.
Well, as far as I can tell, putting a mask on is not yet illegal, although
in some places.
And Texas, who knows? I'm sure that's next. Yeah. So,
I mean, how do you convince people to do that? I think people eventually just push to the point where they realize that we are in a dire situation. So I don't know. It's hard to say. Different things mean different people. What do you think, Scott?
I mean, I think about back when I first got involved 20 something years ago, and I felt like I did everything. I tried everything. Went to protests. I organized protests. I signed petitions. I made petitions. I, was a big proponent of direct action, more than just marching and protesting and holding a sign in front of an office building. And I don't think everything is for everybody. But at that point in my life, I wanted to see what I felt good about and what I felt like was being effective. And so I would just encourage people to, it's a little bit of an experiment, right? It's a little bit of a laboratory of some kind of resistance. I mean, I think saying no all the time is not always the best thing. I think sometimes we have to figure out what we support or what we're behind. But I also think that, there's a lot of bad to say no to and a lot of bad to protest or take direct action on. So I would just encourage people to see what fits for them, and then become friends with the people who do the same thing and, don't do it alone. Well, I guess some things you should do alone, but don't, you're not alone, and don't isolate yourself. Anyway.
I guess just recently we've seen the right go after, beer, and people are going into Target and tearing, freaking, the store apart, and nothing happens to them. And I guess that's the part that, kind of really makes me really frustrated when you see, these people, they're boycotting Bud Light and they're boycotting Target and doing all kinds of stupid shit, and they're going after, transgendered kids and you name it. And none of these positions have any kind of majority support, but they do it and they get away with it. And yet, when it comes to saving the planet, it seems like far too many people are too delicate about this. And, I think right now what we're running into, especially now, is, you have an elections barely a year away, and it's going to come out again from everybody, you know, like you can't get Trump back, so you have to accept Biden, right? Or you have to accept the Democrats, who haven't been any better on these issues than Trump was, really, you know, in terms of opening up, you know, fields for oil exploration and extractive industries and things like that. So I guess that's where I'm really frustrated. I have no clue. I have no answers, obviously, but I see the right wing just like be as batshit crazy and as extreme as possible, and it succeeds. And people who have most, you know, people who actually have support, whose positions have support, seem kind of like paralyzed by it all, and I don't know why.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think part of it, I think, is that
this got bleak. We were supposed to have fun tonight.
I'm having a blast. I think like a lot of like what comes from the left, the things that we want are very, you know, grand and pie in the sky and rosy and but they are very huge issues, like the climate, you know what I mean? But also like it's also not an issue that's in your face. I mean, it is, but like people aren't walking out, you know, of their house right now and you know, feeling the immediate effect of climate change unless your house is burning down or it's underwater. But even then, people aren't like, well, I think this is a problem. And it's like, oh, it's just a natural weather occurrence. But, you know, you have people that are very, you know, you can go out and see a Bud Light. You can go out to your favorite Target store and see the rainbow, you know, clothing. And it's very in your face. And these campaigns, for the lack of a better term, they provide things for people to react to in a tangible way. And I think, like, to me, when I think of like a pressure campaign, that's one of the most important things is like you have something that people can engage with that is tangible, that they can see the results of their actions, and preferably they can see the success of their actions. And I think, at least with the left, we don't provide a lot of that in our activism. It's hard to see the climate getting better. It's easy to see Bud Light's profits go down and their CEO, whoever it was, to be like, oh, we made a mistake here because a bunch of people, because Kid Rock shot up some Bud Light cans in his backyard. And I think when we organize our campaigns, we have to give tangible things for people to do and tangible goals for people to see. And we don't do a lot of that. But I do think that is like the cool thing about grassroots pressure campaigning is that, and even like why I think some people really take to direct action is because you have things that you can do and you can see the results sometimes immediately. But it's not, you know, the left doesn't have a lot of things like that that allows a lot of their population or their, you know, their communities to engage in. And I think that's part of the problem.
I have one last question. I don't know if Bob has any last questions.
Well, this is, and if you don't want to answer this, you don't have to. But when we mentioned like Bud Light and LGBT, I'm kind of curious because there have been a few articles in the last year or so. I think one was in The Intercept where it talked about specifically among left groups how a lot of these issues, I hate to use the word wokeness, but a lot of these issues are kind of tearing apart left groups because, you know, a group may be organized to deal with issues like climate change or something like that. But within that group, you have claims now of, you know, white supremacy or ableism or whatever. And, you know, I don't know how real that is, how big that is, but do you think that's a real thing? And do you think that's kind of a barrier on the left, even when, you know, groups are organized to deal with a specific issue, but then they have these other issues internally, which are kind of, you know, mucking everything up?
Yeah, I think that I think the left has a lot of different issues and a lot of people that want to engage in that single issue. And I think when we start engaging I think this is a much broader, like, systemic issue with social justice movements in the left, is that we have not really properly organized ourselves in the framework of collective liberation or intersectionality, so that when people come to these movements, they realize that that these issues are interconnected, and a fight for one is a fight for all. And so I think that, like, when we present ourselves, like, for instance, in the animal rights movement, a lot of it is like, we just need to save all these non-human animals, the cows and the chickens and everything else, you know, fuck all that. Like, we can fix that later. It's like, no, you can't grow liberation out of the right. You can't grow liberation out of like selectively choosing who gets to be free and who doesn't. And so I think the big mistake of social justice movements lately is its inability to see how it's all connected. And, we see even back in I'm certainly not an expert in any of this stuff, and I'm sure you all could speak better to it than I could. But, you look at the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, and how he kind of realized later in life, he starts the Poor People's Campaign, if I'm not mistaken, organizing poor people and lower class with civil rights and anti-war, and trying to bring all these people together. And I think, he realized that liberation is liberation, and we all deserve to be free. And he got a lot of pushback for it. But, I think even back then, that was this radical idea that we shouldn't do these things. But if we don't, we never have the ability to build bridges with other communities and movements and learn from one another. And as being in the redhead stepchild social justice movement, the animal rights movement, no one wants to talk to the animal rights people, but also kind of for good reason. Sometimes we're kind of assholes. More often than not.
Well, you're not, but I've
to
run into a few.
Yeah,
optimistic vegan.
Yeah. No longer the cranky vegan; he's the happy vegan.
There's a lot of judgment in
the contented vegan. How about that?
Yes. Okay, we can do that for sure. There's a lot of that in the left, including the animal rights movement, where we want to be very separate, and we're not going to win that way because you're fighting against the right, who's just oh, you fucking hate people, or you like guns, and you're against abortion, and you love God. Well, come on board. We don't care how fucking bonkers you are. That's the difficult part of organizing with organizing ourselves with dignity and respect for people, is that it makes it harder.
It's interesting. My last question was around movement stuff, like this sort of interconnected stuff. I forget, I was recently talking to some people about the WTO protests in Seattle, where we actually did see this sort of movement of movements emerge, at least temporarily, around with labor and environmental and sweatshop groups and animal rights groups. And it seems like that movement, that sort of, it's not a movement, but that sort of spirit is kind of I feel like that I saw that spirit kind of emerge again in 2020, but I don't see it as much. And I'm kind of curious, especially around the animal rights movement, if you see, people within the animal rights movement becoming more aware of those dynamics, and we need to work with climate groups, or we need to work with social justice groups. Is there any sort of trend like that going on with the animal rights movement, or is there a sort of single issue focus?
It's hard to say. I would think that I've been involved in the animal rights movement since 1995, and I think there's always been pockets that understand the connection of liberation struggles, particularly with ecology and things like that. I think as time has moved on in the animal rights movement, it became less and less of that. With the SHAC campaign, we certainly tried to have those connections, but I think we kind of lost our interest in other movements in ecology and the environment and wildlife and things like that. And now and at the advent of the internet and social media, it seems like maybe not as much now, but in the last few years, there definitely was more right-leaning people that appeared in the animal rights movement and kind of co-opted the movement, or just were legit animal rights vegans that were also into right-wing politics, that were so ingrained in that that started to blossom, and you see more and more of it now. But at the same time, I also think you do see more and more people that understand the idea of collective liberation. And the animal rights movement, they also called it total liberation, you're a total liberationist because you believe in liberation for all.
Is it an all lives matter sort of notion, or is that different?
Total liberation?
Yeah.
No, it's more they understand people, they're activists that believe in the concept of intersectionality or collective liberation. Okay. They believe in liberation for everyone, not a all lives matter type of thing.
Okay. Just clarify.
Yeah.
So,
No, the all lives
if
matter people
you're,
do exist in the animal rights movement, and they are the more right-leaning people that are like, why are we protesting against police brutality when, this many animals killed there? Well,
okay.
because they're all connected, motherfucker. Like, figure it out. So yeah, it's hard to say. I feel like with social media and everyone has a platform and everyone's, in front of a screen and everyone's watching each other and can spout whatever opinion they want, myself included. I think that like it allows people to be way more brazen with their like controversial take. And when you don't have the ability to meet in person and like have a conversation, like that stuff just sprouts up more and more and more. And I think in the animal rights movement, we have a certain level of privilege amongst most people, or a lot of people in the animal rights movement, where this is the one issue they have to worry about. They don't have to worry about poverty or systemic racism or even the effects of like the climate crisis, flooding their homes or fires ravaging them, or they're becoming climate refugees. Like this is the one thing that they have the ability to worry about. And so it's like, that's what they focus on. And don't understand why the other issues are important. So, and a lot of times those people have platforms and it's frustrating, but
with 1 million followers.
Yeah.
Well, unless Bob has anything else.
No, if you want to tell them about the Cranky Vegan and all the good stuff you do and how you're helping fund different groups, say a few words about that.
Sure, I do. Online, I go by the Cranky Vegan, which is a good lesson as to why you should pick a screen name smartly, because eventually you get stuck with something, and I got stuck with the Cranky Vegan. But I do a YouTube channel where I talk about the kind of, it's like a weekly thing about animal rights activism and news and strategies. And it's not just about animal rights, but I think it's sometimes interesting conversations about strategy and tactics for grassroots activism. I also do a podcast called Radicals and Revolutionaries, where in season 1, we talked to the people that started the Animal Liberation Front and the hunt saboteurs and other radical pockets of direct action in the UK back in the 60s and 70s. It was just really interesting to hear how like they broke into buildings and like liberated animals and like burnt laboratories to the ground in 1972. Like really fascinating. We're working on season 2, which takes place same idea, but how it originated in the United States. And then I also do a Patreon. People are familiar with Patreon, where I take 100% of the money and we donate it every month. So every month every member of the Patreon can nominate a place, and then we all vote on where we send the money each month. And we send 100% of it to a nonprofit grassroots organization, project, or a sanctuary, animal sanctuary that takes care of animals that have been rescued from situations of use and abuse. And since October 2020, we've given away, I think, close to $120,000, which has been pretty amazing. And the majority of the people that join for $2 a month. So
I'm a patron for the Cranky Vegan for that. Like I think I give $3 a month.
Nice.
Yeah.
So you're in the minority of the people that donate. But it's cool. It's like a good lesson that like people feel good about it, but it's a good lesson of like whatever you can do, whether it's give $2 or give $20 a month, if we all work together, how matter big or how small, like we can really make a difference in a big way in a lot of lives and support each other. So it's cool. It's a good thing. I enjoy it.
Thanks as always.
Yeah. Jake's annual appearance on the Green Red podcast talking about direct action.
I always tell you this,
pleasure.
Animal rights is not an issue I really get deeply involved with.
Yeah.
But whenever I listen to you, I get so many different ideas just about organizing in general. It doesn't matter what your particular issue is. I think the stuff you're talking about really is relevant and important and useful, no matter what.
Yeah,
so
I appreciate that. And to me, ultimately, that's what I want. I want to talk to people that aren't just animal rights activists. I want all of us to talk together and strategize together, because I think we can do cool things when we all come together.
Yeah.
The Rosy Vegan.
The Rosy Vegan. Folks, you've been listening to the Rosy Vegan, Jake Conroy, talking about direct action, the state of direct action these days. If you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on an audio platform, subscribe there, and also think about giving us a rate and review. It helps us with the algorithms. And if you really want to support us, go to greenredpodcast.org and hit the support button, or go to Patreon and become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And we will all talk to you again later. Jake, it's been real. It's always good seeing you. And everybody else, go out and make trouble and misbehave.